They burned my field the night before harvest. I found the ash still warm when I opened the gate, like the land itself had been breathing under a blanket of fire. And in that moment, standing there with my boots sunk in gray, I knew this wasn't some careless spark. It was a message. It was the kind of message that makes you rethink the people you thought you knew, the kind that forces you to decide whether you'll bend or whether you'll stand and answer back. My name's Cole Harper, and I run a small patch of ground I inherited from my grandfather, a place he called Willow Run. Though there aren't many willows left out here anymore, just the old sycamore that leans over the creek and a dam he used to swear by. People around here know my farm for the corn and for the old ledger my grandfather kept, a leather book with entries about water releases and maintenance that read like a religion. I keep that ledger on my shelf more out of habit than reverence until the night the field goes up and everything in the book becomes the only proof that I might not be crazy. It started small, in the way these things do. Notices from a homeowners group, Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, stapled to my mailbox. Complaints about visual impact, non-conforming structures, a polite-sounding letter demanding I remove a stack of firewood that had sat in the same place for 30 years. One of the board members, Vivian Hale, stopped by once, cake in a box, smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke about harmony and community standards like a preacher with a checklist. I nodded, I smiled, and I made a mental note to lock the shed. You get used to being the odd man out in a subdivision, even if your property was here first. New developments have rules and nice lawns and trustees who like things neat. They have a way of making those neat lines feel like the only lines that matter. But people also do things when they think they can hide behind community standards. They push, they intimidate, and if the rules don't do it, they'll find other ways. So when I saw the field, the first feeling was disbelief, then anger, then a cold, steady, sort of planning mind that I didn't always recognize in myself. The burn wasn't random. The scorch line was clean, like a hand had traced a pen across the earth. The irrigation lines had been melted in places I couldn't explain, not by wind, not by chance. Ranger, my mutt who follows me like a shadow, nosed something out of the ash, a scorched metal canister, half buried, with a smudged logo. I put it in a paper bag like evidence, because that's what the part of me that remembers courtrooms and process told me to do. You want to know the thing about being alone in this, and it's important. It's not that you don't have neighbors. It's that a lot of neighbors are looking at their property values. They worry about lawsuits and bad press, and most of them don't want the hassle of picking sides. So your allies tend to be people with a stake that isn't easily priced friends, one or two on the county side. Someone like Eddie Grant, who used to run surveys for the state before retirement and likes to tinker with old engines on his porch. Eddie came by the next afternoon, looked at the char in the canister, and said, this wasn't a wildfire. Someone wanted that to burn. Maya Cruz, the county environmental compliance officer, someone I met once at the farmer's market, took the soil samples, and she knew just enough to make me breathe again. She called it atypical accelerant traces, and her voice on the phone had that professional calm that made me trust her. She ran the lab results. She pulled thermal satellite imagery for the date and time of the burn, and those images, the ones that make you feel like the world is smaller and more watched than you thought, showed heat spots moving with a pattern. It didn't match any known natural cause. It matched human intent. Meanwhile, Vivian and her board kept their smiles for the cameras. They put out a carefully worded press release about unfortunate natural causes and community empathy for the homeowner, as if pity could rewrite scorch marks. But they also filed a cease and desist over an old shed on my property, and suddenly I had legal threats on top of charred corn and a house full of smoke smell that never quite left the walls. What saved me from panic, what kept me from making the kind of mistake people make when they're furious, was a thud in the ledger. My grandfather had every release noted there. Dates, times, a signature, a notation about downstream effects. There was a clause he underlined once that I'd never paid much attention to, something about drought release authority and maintenance rights conferred upon heirs. I got to reading like a man who had just found the old map to his home, and then I realized the ledger was more than memory. It was legal continuity. It didn't say do whatever you want, but it gave a family the authority to operate the flood control gate in coordination with the county, in emergency, or to preserve the floodplain as written in deeds filed long before Cedar Hollow even existed. That discovery gave me options that didn't involve vigilante revenge. It gave me paper, and paper matters. I started logging everything. Photos, timestamps, emails, receipts, anything to show a chain of custody, anything to show I'd acted within the law. It felt a little like armor. Eddie and Maya helped me pull together the evidence, the lab results, the satellite image, copies of the HOA's budget that showed contractors with familiar logos, and, painfully, receipts and invoices that connected work near my property to vendors the association used. It was messy and bureaucratic and exactly the kind of thing that wears people out, which is probably why a lot of folks don't do it. You know how these battles get painted in two dimensions, homeowner versus HOA, David against Goliath, and how the internet loves those stories because they're simple? Real life is messy, eh? There were neighbors who complained about weeds, and neighbors who brought over casseroles. There were board members who made threatening calls, and one or two who quietly told me they were worried about Vivian's tactics. There are people who are afraid to lose that status in a small town. I learned who would stand with me and who would duck. It stings to be abandoned by people you once shared Thanksgiving with, but you learn where your true strength is. It isn't always a crowd. Sometimes it's the stubbornness that runs in your grandfather's blood. I filed notices. I spoke with the county about the dam operations. I didn't want to fight for the fight's sake. I wanted the truth. I wanted the county to see what was done illegally in a floodplain, and I wanted the evidence to be undeniable. I notified the county of pending operation of the reservoir gate. The ledger became my voice in that formal language. I followed the process. It felt cautious, even timid at times, until the moment it wasn't. The Cedar Hollow Board threw a community celebration, a grand opening for a new clubhouse they'd built over wetlands, a polished event with ribbon cutting and hors d'oeuvres from a local caterer. Vivian posed for photos with a giant ribbon and a ribbon cutter that looked too large for the tiny hands that kept it in place. It was a public relations dream and, in retrospect, the sort of public moment that forces daylight on people who like to hide in the shadows. That celebration felt like a taunt after the field burned. They were trying to show normalcy, to prove nothing had changed, to display their power like an invitation. So I did what the ledger and the law allowed me to do, and I did it with cold attention to the rules. I filed the final notice, I logged it, and I coordinated with the county hydrologist not because I wanted chaos, but because the law recognized a family's right to maintain a flood control structure. There were county observers, there were protocols, and there were cameras because everything is recorded now and, frankly, that's the good part. I opened the gate in full compliance with the procedures we were instructed to follow, not to punish, not to cause harm beyond what was necessary for the ecosystem, but to flush a system that had been clogged by unpermitted fill and to make visible what had been done under cover of improvement. When the water began to move, it did it with the indifference of weather. Water doesn't hold grudges. It simply follows gravity and the contours of what humans have shaped. At the clubhouse party, people noticed their footings starting to feel soft, their ornamental culverts whispering under pressure. Chairs shifted, a small yacht of a party float in the ornamental pond bobbed like a tiny ship caught in a surprise tide. Vivian, who had been smiling for cameras, now had her hands on her hips like someone who had been caught mid-act, defensive and incredulous. "What did you think, Cole?" she shouted when she found me at the edge of the field, her voice brittle. "You think you can just wash us away?" "I'm not washing anyone away," I said. "I'm letting water do what water does. I'm doing what my grandfather did, and I'm doing it with notice. The county's watching." Some of the guests cheered Vivian because she had been groomed to make them laugh and feel safe. Others looked around like people beginning to understand they had been built on fragile ground. Reporters arrived, and the county inspectors took measurements. The unpermitted fill under the clubhouse, the kind of expensive landscaping that tries to outsmart creeks, began to show signs of failing. Insurance adjusters and environmental regulators started to pull at threads. The story that had been only mine suddenly had a way of being told by others, with more authority than my anger. What happened next wasn't cinematic revenge, it was paperwork and consequence. The county issued violation notices for unpermitted work in a floodplain. Insurance companies threatened non-renewal for structures that hadn't disclosed alterations, and people began to realize their property values had been propped up with shortcuts that now looked like liabilities. The HOA's insurance lapsed in the shuffle. Vivian's pleasant facade cracked and splintered. There were board members who wanted out, developers who started distancing themselves, and neighbors who began to understand that the neatness they liked had been achieved by bending rules that protect all of us. I had imagined grand vindication, a cinematic moment where the antagonist is publicly shamed and runs away. Reality gave me a more complicated closure. Vivian resigned under pressure, yes, but many people were hurt by the fallout. Homeowners who had borrowed against their houses, people who'd made life choices based on a promise of stability. That part of IT lodged in me like a splinter. I didn't want to see neighbors' lives wrecked. I wanted accountability, not collateral damage. So I met with the county and with outreach groups with people who could help residents navigate insurance claims and appeals. I helped where I could. The ledger didn't fix everything, but the ledger made real a truth. You don't get to build in a floodplain and pretend the floodplain doesn't exist. In quiet hours, I thought about what I'd lost. My corn yield that year was gone, charred into ghostly rows that no one would want for compost. My heart carried the sting of betrayal by neighbors who turned their backs because it was easier than asking uncomfortable questions. But there was also a smallness that crept back in, the relief that the old sycamore still stood, that the creek had been cleared of some of the worst debris, that a lot of our community, the people who work on the soil, who measure things by harvest and say we'll get by, started talking. There were conversations at the diner that hadn't happened before. People who'd never said a word about water rights in their lives now had opinions, and sometimes opinions changed things. The most important thing to me was how my grandfather's ledger, a book of stubborn, meticulous notes, proved that history can hold you up in a fight. Paper, in the end, doesn't have muscle. It doesn't have teeth. But it has memory, and when the law hears memory backed up by process, folks who think they can rewrite the landscape out of self-interest find themselves in a hard light. The moral of the story, if you want one, is not as neat as victories in movies. It's about stewardship and accountability. It's about how power hides in manners and ribbons and polite press releases, and how you need more than outrage to counter that. You need patience, you need record keeping, and you need allies who know how the system works. It's also about the human cost when communities are manipulated and the fine line between rightful defense and the harm that can ripple outward. If you ask me whether what I did was right, I won't give you a sermon. I'll tell you what I felt. Steady, unavoidable, necessary. I felt the weight of my grandfather's handwriting and the smell of corn and the way Ranger leaned against my leg like he could sense the world tipping and wanted to be the rock. I felt the cruelty that can wear a smile in public, and I felt the strange relief when sunlight burned through the smoke and you could finally see the mess people had made. There were moments I wasn't proud of, phone calls I let go to voicemail, Nights I stared at the ledger and felt something cold and hungry, but mostly there were quiet days when I mended fence and planted cover crop and fixed irrigation heads. Those days grounded me. They reminded me that stewardship isn't just legal rights and court filings. It's the thing you do when nobody's looking, the thing you do because the land trusts you to be decent. Some neighbors forgave me. Others still won't speak when we pass. Life isn't neat, but it moves forward. The creek flows on, and in spring the sycamore leafed out like a slow, deliberate promise. If there's anything I want you to take away other than the fact that you should pay attention to the people who make the rules in your town, it's that justice isn't a single flash of righteous fury. It's also messy and imperfect, and sometimes it means helping neighbors whose choices you think were wrong. Because the point isn't to win at all costs, but to make a community that lasts. So now I'm asking you, what would you have done? Was this right, using the ledger and the county process to expose unpermitted work and bring consequences, or did I go too far by timing the release for a public party, by making the problem visible in a way that panicked people? Was I vindicated, or did I become the kind of person people fear to be? I want to hear your take. Drop it in the comments below. Tell me if you think I was in the right, or if you'd have handled it another way. Share if you've ever had a run-in with overreaching community rules, or if you've seen local power hide behind polite words.